Mother Teresa, a name that would one day be whispered in fear and reverence on blood-stained streets, was, for now, synonymous with compassion in a city forgotten by God. Before becoming a legend, she was the guardian of a small orphanage on the dusty border of Mexico, a bastion of innocence in the heart of a cartel's territory. Her figure, wrapped in a simple habit, was a constant and calming presence against the aridity of the landscape and the local morality. With a faith that bordered on stubbornness, she built a sanctuary of clay bricks, where the laughter of orphaned children was the only music that defied the oppressive silence imposed by fear. To those little ones, she was the only family, the personification of security in a world that had only offered them abandonment and cruelty. Her journey, though anonymous to the world, was a silent war waged daily with prayer and courage. She believed that her mission transcended the walls of her small refuge, and in her most intimate prayers she asked that her story might echo and inspire others to light a candle in the darkness. I feel that my voice needs to reach more souls, and if this account is in any way touching your heart, I ask that you subscribe and help us reach our goal of 1,000 souls united in prayer and support. Please comment with where you are watching from. Knowing that we are not alone in this fight gives us immeasurable strength to continue. Every new subscriber is one more soldier in our army of hope. Proof that goodness, even when whispered, can drown out the sound of gunshots and the injustice that surrounds us. The city was the private fiefdom of a man known as El Hierro, the sadistic leader of the cartel that controlled every breath and every business. The official law was a farce, a facade for the brutal order he imposed. The dusty streets witnessed drug deals, extortions, and disappearances with a frightening normality, while the local police served only as his uniformed guard dogs. In this setting of moral decay, Mother Teresa's orphanage was a glaring anomaly, with its colorful gate and the flowers that insisted on blooming under the scorching sun. The place was a visual and spiritual affront to El Hierro's empire. It was a symbol that not everything was for sale, and not everyone could be bought or intimidated, which made it a dangerously visible target. Old Father Mateo, Teresa's mentor, and the parish priest of a nearly always empty church, lived in a state of constant worry. His trembling hands held his rosary as he advised her in a low, almost inaudible voice. "Teresa, your courage is a gift from God, but you display it like a crown on a battlefield. Men like El Hierro do not destroy what they fear. They desecrate what is sacred to prove that nothing is above them," he would warn. But Mother Teresa possessed a conviction forged in a different furnace. "If our faith only serves to hide us, Father, then it is worthless. It is precisely because this place is and sacred that we must defend it. God does not abandon us in battle. He gives us the strength to fight," she would reply, her eyes shining with a certainty the old priest had long since lost. Her bravery was not just rhetoric. One afternoon, cartel sicarios arrived to collect a food donation that had arrived for the orphanage. Without hesitation, Mother Teresa stood between them and the food, a small but impassible figure. She did not raise her voice. She simply stared at them with an authority that was not of this world, and said, "This food was sent by God for his children. To take it, you will have to answer directly to him." The men, accustomed to a world of violence and brute force, were disarmed by a power they could not comprehend. Her faith was an invisible yet impenetrable shield. They retreated, humiliated and confused, leaving behind the seed of a legend and the beginning of a dangerous enmity. The news of the nuns' defiance reached the ears of El Hierro, who received it with a cruel smile. He, a man who saw himself as a local deity, was intrigued and offended. El Hierro was the personification of distorted faith, making offerings to popular saints before ordering massacres. The existence of a moral authority that was not his own was intolerable. That woman, Mother Teresa, as the people began to call her with admiration, represented a purity that exposed his own corruption. In his luxurious ranch, he decided it was not enough to kill her. It was necessary to destroy the symbol she represented, to make her oasis of hope a desolate example of what happens when one challenges the true power of that land. On silent nights, when the children slept and the only sound was the howl of the desert wind, Mother Teresa felt the weight of her mission. Kneeling in the improvised chapel, she confessed her weaknesses to God, the fear she felt gnawing at her courage during the day. She did not ask for the cup to be taken from her, but for the strength to drink it too. The dregs. There was a constant battle in her soul, a conflict between her instinct to protect the children at all costs and the awareness that her own defiant presence could be the magnet that drew disaster upon them. It was the eternal question of faith. To what extent does light provoke the wrath of darkness? She sought answers in the silence, unaware that the silence was about to be irrevocably broken. The calm before the storm came in the form of a small celebration, an anonymous donation, allowed for a rare party in the orphanage courtyard, with sweets, music, and the pure joy of children who, for one day, forgot the world outside. Mother Teresa watched it all with a bittersweet feeling, her heart aching with so much love and so much fear. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and she saved that image like a sacred photograph in her soul. The sight of the children running and smiling, their faces illuminated by the golden twilight, would be the last memory of peace. It would be the paradise lost that would fuel the fires of hell that were about to consume her life and forge her terrible rebirth. The darkness descended without warning, not like the soft desert twilight, but like a trapdoor opening beneath the world's feet. The sound of powerful engines tore through the night, followed by the brutal crunch of twisting metal as trucks smashed through the orphanage's blue gate, crushing it like a toy. Men with covered faces and rifles in hand leaped from the vehicles, moving with predatory efficiency. Panic erupted. Mother Teresa, who was putting the younger children to bed, felt the ground tremble and her blood run cold. Her first and only instinct was that of a lioness protecting her cubs. She ran to the main dormitory, her body forming a barrier at the door as she screamed for the children to hide. Her nun's habit transformed into a useless shield against the tide of evil invading her sanctuary. The prayer on her lips was replaced by a cry of defiance. El Hierro watched everything from his seat in the first truck, not as a warrior, but as an emperor inspecting a demolition. He stepped out of the vehicle calmly, his lit cigar illuminating his satisfied smile. He walked over the flowers Teresa cultivated with such care, crushing them under his crocodile leather boots. The massacre was quick, methodical, and merciless, an act of theological terrorism designed to annihilate hope. He found Mother Teresa immobilized by his men, forcing her to watch the destruction of everything she loved. "You wanted God's attention, nun," he whispered in her ear, his breath of tequila and smoke poisoning the air. "Tonight, I am the only God in this city, and this is my answer to your prayers." The sound of gunshots was his final blasphemy. They left her alive, collapsed amidst the rubble of her life, a lone witness to the carnage. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise of the violence. It was a heavy, absolute silence, filled only with the smell of gunpowder and blood, and the distant sound of the vehicle's engines fading into the desert. The dust settled slowly, revealing a scene of total desecration. The walls that once displayed colorful drawings of suns and houses were now scarred with bullet holes. Broken toys and torn pages from children's books were scattered across the floor like dead leaves. Mother Teresa remained motionless for a time that could have been minutes or an eternity, her brain refusing to process what her eyes saw. The oasis had become a cemetery, and she was its only ghost. Slowly, she moved, not as a person, but as a broken automaton. The initial shock gave way to a pain so overwhelming that there were no tears to express it. It was an abyss opening in her soul, swallowing her faith, her love, her very identity. She crawled across the floor, her fingers touching the lifeless face of one of the children, the small rosary she herself had given him still around. His neck. She looked up at the crucifix on the chapel wall, now broken in half. The heavens were silent. God was not there. In that moment, the sister who believed in forgiveness, the mother who trusted in divine providence, died. In the void, left by her shattered faith, something new and terrible began to take shape, a seed of darkness planted by the hand of El Hierro himself. From the ashes of her soul, a cold flame began to burn. It was not hope, not faith. It was rage, a pure, biblical rage that burned away the pain and transformed it into an unshakable purpose. There, on her knees on the sacred ground that had been desecrated with the blood of her innocents, she made a new vow, not to God, but to the souls that had been stolen. Justice would not come from the heavens, it would be forged by her own hands on earth. Her enemies had wanted her broken, a silent martyr. Instead, they had created a monster. This was her true baptism, not in holy water, but in blood and fury. The decision was made. She would not seek solace or redemption, she would seek annihilation. From that moment on, her prayers would be with bullets, and her forgiveness would be delivered only in hell. The city buried the memory of the massacre, along with the small bodies. Mother Teresa disappeared, and the official version, whispered by corrupt policemen, was that the nun, driven mad by grief, had wandered into the desert to die. El Hierro celebrated his victory, certain that the symbol of hope had been permanently erased. But in the ruins of an abandoned chapel miles from the city, a ghost was being born. Teresa spent weeks in a self-imposed purgatory, feeding on what little she could hunt and the fury that consumed her. The physical pain of hunger and exertion was a penance that silenced the pain in her soul. She no longer prayed, she trained, transforming her body, once a vessel for charity, into a lethal precision weapon. Her habit was replaced with dark, practical clothes, but the rosary remained not as an object of faith, but as the tool of her new vocation. Her greatest weapon, however, was not physical. It was knowledge. Years spent sitting in the confessional, listening to the darkest secrets of the city, had given her a map of the place's corrupt soul. She knew which cartel soldier cheated on his wife, which merchant laundered money for El Hierro, which cop had gambling debts. They were sins whispered in search of an absolution she no longer offered. Instead, she catalogued them in her mind, turning human weaknesses into tactical vulnerabilities. She became a hunter of secrets, using the intimacy she once offered for comfort as a means for destruction. Every sin confessed to her in the past became a nail in the coffin she would build for her enemies. She did not need an army. The city itself, with its web of guilt and lies, would be her unwilling accomplice. The first target was a man named Ramiro, one of the sicarios she had seen laughing during the massacre. She watched him for days, learning his routine, his arrogance, his path home after drinking at the local bar. The execution was not clean or distant, it was brutally personal. She waited for him in a dark alley, and the confrontation was clumsy, desperate, and dirty. He was stronger, but she was driven by a fury that transcended physical strength. The sound of his life draining away was the first amen of her new mass. After the act, she vomited, her body shaking uncontrollably, not from guilt, but from the terrible, overwhelming certainty that she had crossed a threshold from which she could never return. The woman who was Sister Sofia was dead and buried. Only Mother Teresa, the Reaper, remained. The next morning, Ramiro's body was found. The city, accustomed to violence, would have barely noticed were it not for one macabre detail. A simple wooden rosary was wrapped tightly around his neck, the crucifix embedded in his throat. The news spread like wildfire. The old folks crossed themselves, whispering of vengeful spirits. The cartel men scoffed, but a chill ran down their spines. It was not the style of a rival gang. It was something different, something ritualistic. The name Mother Teresa was spoken again, not with the pity of before, but with a new tone of fear and dark admiration. An urban legend began to be born in the dusty streets, the story of an avenging angel who had returned from the grave to collect blood debts with divine interest. Il Hierro, on his throne of opulence, laughed at the story. He dismissed it as a bizarre coincidence, perhaps an internal score settling disguised as superstition. His arrogance was his greatest weakness. He could not conceive of a threat that did not come from a man with more guns or more money. While he ignored the signs, Mother Teresa moved in the shadows, planning her next step. She knew she needed more than just sporadic executions. She needed eyes and ears inside the organization, and she knew exactly where to find them, among the young men forcibly recruited, those whose eyes had not yet been completely consumed by evil. Her war was just beginning, and it would be a campaign of psychological terror, dismantling El Hierro's empire from the inside out, one sinner at a time. Her next capture was not to kill. Javier was a skinny boy, barely older than some of her children at the orphanage, who served as a lookout for the cartel. She cornered him on a rooftop, her knife at his throat before he could scream. In the terror of his eyes, she did not see the cruelty of Ramiro, but the fear of a cornered animal. She gave him a choice: die for a man who did not care about him, or live by helping to bring him down. "I don't kill children," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse, "but I will not hesitate to kill a soldier. The choice is yours." She saw the spark of decency he fought to hide and gambled on it. By sparing him, she was not just gaining an informant. She was affirming to herself that there was still a line, however faint, that she would not cross. Javier accepted not out of courage, but out of a greater fear of El Hierro than of her. The cartel had killed his father over a small debt, forcing him to work for them to protect his mother and sister. He lived in a daily hell, and this angel of death offered him a way out, however dangerous. He became Teresa's bridge to the cartel's inner workings, providing information on smuggling routes, weapons caches, and the schedules of important men. Their alliance was fragile, built on mutual fear and a desperate need for redemption. For Javier, she was a chance to atone for his sins. For Teresa, he was a mirror of the innocence she was avenging, and a painful reminder of the redemption she believed she no longer deserved. The first fruit of their alliance was an attack on a drug convoy heading for the border. Using Javier's information, Mother Teresa set a trap on a deserted road. It was not a shootout, but a precise sabotage. Blown tires, a fire started with a homemade Molotov cocktail, and the ensuing chaos. She did not stay to fight. The goal was to disrupt, to cause financial loss, and to deepen mistrust. When the survivors returned empty-handed, El Hierro did not see a phantom attack, but rather a robbery or betrayal. The seed of paranoia had been planted. Teresa proved that she could hurt his empire without shedding blood, attacking what he valued most, his profit and his absolute control over the NUN territory. Next came more deaths, always surgical, always symbolic. A cartel accountant was found drowned in his own swimming pool, a rosary weighing down his neck. A captain known for his brutality was found in his car, killed with a single precise shot, the same rosary hanging from the rearview mirror. Panic began to set in. The low-ranking soldiers started to desert, fearing they would be the next target of the rosary ghost. The legend of Mother Teresa grew with each body, a horror story that the cartel bosses told to scare new recruits. She was not just a killer, she was a judgment, an invisible force that knew their sins and hunted them in the shadows, turning their own city into her personal hunting ground. El Hierro's paranoia exploded. His business was being hurt, his men were dying or disappearing, and he had no face to blame. Distrust spread like a cancer through his organization. He began to see traitors everywhere, executing 2 of his own lieutenants on the slightest suspicion. Mother Teresa did not need to destroy the entire cartel. She was making it devour itself from within. With each move, She not only eliminated an enemy, but also severed the bonds of loyalty that held El Hierro's empire together. Her knowledge of their weaknesses was the lever she used to topple the structure, and violence was merely the fulcrum. She had become chaos personified. In her ruined chapel, surrounded by a map of the city marked with the names of her targets, Teresa felt the emptiness of her victories. Each crossed-off name brought no peace, only confirmation of how far she had descended. Sometimes, the weight of this solitary crusade is almost unbearable, an echo in a cathedral of silence. If my story, my struggle, resonates with yours, know that your support is the only prayer I can still hear. Subscribing to this channel is more than a click. It is an act of solidarity, a way of telling me that I am not completely alone in this darkness. Every new subscriber gives me the strength to continue, to ensure that other voices like mine are not silenced forever. It is the only communion I have left. Meanwhile, the growing carnage caught the attention of Father Mateo. He heard the terrified confessions of the few cartel men who still dared to enter his church, heard the rumors in the streets. He noticed the rosaries in the newspaper photos, identical to the ones he himself ordered for the diocese, the same ones he had given as gifts to Teresa and the children at the orphanage. A terrible, cold suspicion began to form in his heart. He refused to believe it, but the signs were undeniable. The theology of vengeance spreading through the city had a signature he knew intimately. Driven by a last, desperate sense of duty for her lost soul, he decided to look for her, praying he was wrong. He found her not in the desert, but in the forgotten catacombs beneath his own church, a place only the two of them knew. The sight of her shocked him. The light in her eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a cold, predatory intensity. She was cleaning a rifle with the same reverence with which she used to clean the altar. The confrontation was a clash of two worlds. "Teresa, in God's name, stop this!" he pleaded, his voice breaking. "This is not justice, it is sin. You are becoming the very monster that created them." He held out his hand, his silver crucifix dangling, trying to reach the woman he had known, the soul he still believed he could save. From damnation. Her reply was sharp, devoid of any emotion save a cold contempt for the faith they had once shared. "Your God watched in silence as my children were slaughtered. Where was his justice that night, Father?" she retorted, her voice low and dangerous. "I no longer pray for justice, I deliver it. Monsters do not understand sermons or forgiveness. They only understand pain. I'm simply speaking the only language they taught me to speak. If that makes me a monster in the eyes of your God, so be it. Heaven has abandoned me, so I will make hell my kingdom and their grave." She turned away, ending the conversation, leaving the priest devastated by the certainty that the woman he had come to save was already dead. Despite her steel facade, Father Mateo's words haunted her. For the first time since the massacre, a crack appeared in her armor of vengeance. Doubt, like a slow poison, began to seep in. She saw her reflection in a puddle of dirty water on the catacomb floor and barely recognized the face staring back. The eyes belonged to a stranger, hardened and empty. The question he had planted in her mind blossomed in the solitude. Was she truly seeking justice for the children, or was she just satisfying her own bloodlust, using their memory as an excuse for her brutality? The journey that had begun as a sacred mission of vengeance began to feel dangerously like a fall into the abyss. To silence the priest's voice in her mind, she plunged back into action, planning her most audacious strike yet, the destruction of a cocaine processing lab that was the financial heart of El Hierro's empire. It was a remote facility, heavily guarded. Javier warned her it was a suicide mission, but she needed the noise of fire and battle to drown out the silence of her conscience. The operation was a ballet of calculated violence. She used the night and her knowledge of the terrain to infiltrate, planting homemade explosives at the most vulnerable points. She moved. Like a phantom among the guards, a silent blade that eliminated them one by one before they could raise the alarm. The operation, however, nearly ended in disaster. A guard she had not anticipated surprised her, and a savage fight ensued. She was wounded, a deep gash in her arm and a bruised rib that left her breathless. She managed to kill the man, but the element of surprise was lost. With alarms blaring, she detonated the explosives prematurely, narrowly escaping the fireball that consumed the lab. The escape was a blur of pain and adrenaline, running through the scrubland as cartel men fired blindly into the darkness. She had survived, but the invincibility that surrounded her in her own mind and in others had been shattered. She was flesh and blood, and she could bleed. Alone and wounded in her hideout, the physical pain forced her into a stillness she had been avoiding. As she stitched her own arm with a needle and thread sterilized in fire, she was forced to confront not only her mortality, but also the cost of her war. Every wound on her body was a reflection of the scars deepening in her soul. The priest's face, full of sorrow and disappointment, superimposed itself on her own reflection in the blade of her knife. His question echoed again. Are you becoming the monster that created them? For the first time, she had no immediate, defiant answer. The silence that followed was filled by a new and terrifying companion: guilt. The destruction of the lab was a devastating blow to El Hierro, costing him millions and humiliating him before his partners. Blind with rage, he abandoned any pretense of hunting the ghost in the shadows. He decided to drag it into the light using the cruelest possible bait. He began to terrorize the city. Public executions of ordinary citizens accused of collaborating with the ghost became routine. Food grew scarce as he blocked deliveries. He wanted to turn the people who secretly acclaimed her against her, forcing them to choose between the protection of their avenging angel and survival. The city became a prison camp, and the air grew even heavier with fear and resentment. The people were divided. Some cursed her in whispers, blaming her crusade for El Hierro's brutal retaliation. Others prayed for her in secret, seeing her as their only terrible hope. The legend of Mother Teresa transformed. She was no longer just an avenger, but a tragic figure, a catalyst for the city's pain and possible liberation. Small altars bearing her name began to appear in hidden alleys, with candles and flowers, as if she were a dark saint, the patron of lost causes and desperate justice. She had become a symbol larger than herself, an idea that El Hierro, with all his brutality, could not kill. For her next move, Teresa needed high-level intelligence. She kidnapped one of El Hierro's closest lieutenants, a man named Alvarez, and took him to the catacombs beneath the church. There, in a setting of darkness and sacred symbols, she conducted her own twisted confession. With a knife in place of a crucifix, she forced him to confess his sins, the murders, the extortions, El Hierro's plans. It was not for the absolution of his soul, but for the damnation of his master. Under the pressure of pain and the psychological terror of being judged by a demon with the face of a nun, Alvarez confessed everything he knew, every sordid detail of El Hierro's empire. After extracting the information, she killed him, leaving his body on the altar of the abandoned chapel with the rosary around his neck. But Alvarez's confession contained a revelation that chilled her blood. One of her few contacts in the city, an old merchant who supplied her, had been captured and tortured. Before dying, he had revealed the ghost's true identity. El Hierro now knew. He knew that Mother Teresa was Sister Sofia, the nun he had left alive to suffer. The war had become irrevocably personal for both sides. The ghost's mask had fallen, and now he knew exactly who he was hunting. Javier arrived shortly after, his face pale with dread. He confirmed the news. They know who you are, Mother. They know everything. But the information was even worse. Knowing her connection to the church, to the faith she once professed, El Hierro had devised the perfect trap. He would not come for her. He would make her come to him. They are going to take Father Mateo, Javier said, his voice trembling. They'll take him during Sunday Mass, in front of everyone. They know you won't let that happen. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. It was checkmate. El Hierro was using the last spark of her former humanity against her. Her love and sense of duty toward the man who had been her mentor was the only weakness she had left. She could disappear, leave the priest to his fate, and continue her shadow war, a tactical, logical choice. But the image of Father Mateo's kind face, the only person who had wept for her lost soul, was something she could not ignore. Saving the priest meant walking straight into a deadly trap. In that moment, she knew her war of shadows was over. The final confrontation would be in the light of day, in the most sacred place in the city. Palm Sunday dawned under a grey, oppressive sky, a perfect reflection of the city's mood. The main church was packed, not by faith, but by El Hierro's order. It was a congregation of hostages. On the altar, where the bread and wine would normally be, was Father Mateo on his knees, his face swollen, a pistol to his head. El Hierro, wearing an immaculate white suit, commanded the pulpit, delivering a profane sermon on power and loyalty. He presented himself as the shepherd who would protect his flock from a lone wolf, the demon hiding under the name of a saint. The tension was suffocating, each collective breath a prelude to the announced violence. The air smelled of incense, candle wax, and pure fear, a nauseating mixture that desecrated the sacred space. The great wooden doors of the church creaked open with a sound that echoed like thunder. Mother Teresa stood there, silhouetted against the pale morning light, her figure dark and unmistakable. She was no longer the ghost of the shadows. She was an apparition of flesh and blood, the angel of death come to claim her debt. In her hands was not a palm branch, but a sawed-off shotgun. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. El Hierro smiled, the smile of a predator that has finally cornered its prey. "Behold!" he shouted to the congregation, "the demon dares to enter the house of the Lord for her final judgment." The stillness shattered, and time seemed to freeze. Two kinds of faith, both twisted and absolute, were about to collide in a battle for the city's soul. Mother Teresa's action was the personification of blasphemy and tactics. Instead of firing, she raised the shotgun and shot at the base of the old statue of the Archangel Michael, which stood in a high niche. The heavy plaster and stone image toppled, shattering on the marble floor with a deafening crash, sending up a cloud of dust and debris that engulfed the nave. It was the signal. Chaos erupted. Screams. Panic. The congregation dove to the floor or ran for the exits, providing perfect cover. El Hierro's men, disoriented, began firing blindly into the dust cloud. The church, a place of peace, was instantly transformed into a labyrinth of death, where pews became barricades and the holy air filled with the stench of gunpowder. She moved through the chaos like a vengeful apparition, her intimate knowledge of every pillar and every confessional giving her a deadly advantage. The sicarios, accustomed to fighting in open streets, were in her territory now. She hunted them one by one, a wraith in the smoke, a precise shot from the side aisle, a knife in the darkness of the confessional. The light, filtering through the shattered stained glass windows, cast broken patterns on the floor, illuminating scenes of brutal violence. Blood stained the walls, mixing with the images of the Stations of the Cross. Each death was a step in her profane pilgrimage toward the altar, a prayer answered in the universal language of violence, the only one her enemies understood. Finally, only they remained. Mother Teresa emerged from the dust, wounded but standing, at the foot of the altar. El Hierro waited for her, using Father Mateo's trembling body as a human shield. The battle of bullets gave way to a war of words, the final confession before judgment. "Look at you, nun. Where is your God now? Did he give you permission to become a murderer?" El Hierro mocked. Teresa raised her weapon, her face a mask of cold determination. "God did not give me permission. He gave me a purpose," she replied, her voice echoing in the deadly silence. "My sin is not killing monsters like you. My sin was once believing that prayer would be enough to stop them." Seeing Teresa's hesitation, knowing she would not shoot, for fear of hitting him, Father Matteo made his last and bravest decision. He met her eyes, and in a moment of final clarity, he smiled, a sad, forgiving smile. "Do not let my life be his shield, my child," he whispered, and with a final reserve of strength he threw himself to the side, knocking El Hierro's gun away from himself for a single precious second. It was an act of sacrifice, the final absolution he offered her, freeing her from the one choice she could not make. He gave her a clear target, knowing that the price of her salvation was her eternal damnation. In that instant, there was no more conflict in Mother Teresa's soul. There was only certainty. Time slowed. The shotgun blast was absolute, a final decree that echoed through the vaults of the church. El Hierro fell backward, his white suit stained with the red of his own life, his body collapsing at the foot of the altar he had desecrated. The silence that followed was profound and heavy. Teresa walked slowly toward her. Fallen enemy, smoke rising from the barrel of her gun. She looked at the lifeless face of the man who had taken everything from her, but she felt no triumph, no relief, only a deep, cold void. The war was over. Justice, in its own terrible way, had been served, but victory tasted of bitter ashes. The silence in the church was broken by the sobs of the hostages and the pained groan of Father Matteo, who lay wounded but alive near the altar. Mother Teresa went to him, and for an instant, the killer gave way to the caregiver. She staunched his bleeding with a torn piece of her own clothing, her hands now as skilled with healing as with death. There were no words of comfort or absolution. They just looked at each other, and in the old priest's eyes she saw not condemnation, but a deep, tragic compassion for the soul he had failed to save. He survived, but they both knew that something far more important had died on that altar. She left him to the care of the first citizens who dared to approach, and without looking back, disappeared into the chaos, leaving behind the body of her enemy and the ghost of herself. With the serpent's head cut off, the body of the cartel convulsed and died. The remaining lieutenants, without a leader, turned on each other in a fratricidal struggle for power, and the organization disintegrated into insignificant factions. The city slowly began to breathe again. The police, freed from their corrupt master, began to arrest the cartel's remnants. Order, fragile and stained, began to return. Mother Teresa was never seen again. Her existence passed from the realm of reality to that of myth. She became the dark saint of the border, a legend whispered to frighten both criminals and disobedient children. She had liberated the city, but her name was spoken with the same fear and reverence reserved for forces of nature, a hurricane that cleanses the land but leaves destruction in its wake. Days later, in the ruins of the orphanage, a final farewell was said. She walked through the rubble, touching the bullet-scarred walls that had once been her home. Her vengeance was complete, the list of names crossed off, but the peace she thought she would find was a mirage in the desert of her soul. The silence was no longer filled with the laughter of children, only with the echo of her own sins. This dark journey I have shared comes to an end, and I am grateful for every soul who has witnessed it with me. If my story has served as a warning or a testament, I ask that you subscribe and keep it alive. Helping to share accounts like this ensures that silence never completely smothers the truth, however painful it may be. May my voice, now, become a part of yours. There, in that cemetery of memories, she performed her last ritual. Carefully, she removed what was left of her habit, the vestments that had defined her as a symbol of faith, and later, of terror. She folded the dark, stained fabric as if it were a shroud, burying it under a pile of bricks along with the rosary that had become her signature. In doing so, she buried Sister Sofia and Mother Teresa. She put on simple civilian clothes, the clothes of a nobody, of a woman with no name and no past. It was not an act of purification or the search for a new life, but an acknowledgement of her permanent state of exile. She no longer belonged to God's flock, nor to the pack of wolves. She was a separate entity, a soul in an earthly purgatory. Finally, she turned her back on the ruins, on the city that had bled for her sake, and began to walk toward the infinite horizon of the desert. The setting sun enveloped her, turning her silhouette into an anonymous, solitary figure against the reddish vastness. There was no destination, only a departure. She did not seek redemption, for she knew she would not find it. She did not seek oblivion, for she knew she did not deserve it. She just walked, a faithless pilgrim, haunted by the ghosts she had created and the angels she could not save. Free from her mission, but forever chained to her deeds, she became just another story lost in the dust. A wandering soul, forever trapped on the desolate border between heaven and hell.